Tonight we're in Scunthorpe, and welcome to Question Time. And welcome to you at home. Our audience here, of course, are going to ask the questions, and to our panel, who don't know those questions till they hear them. The Conservative Home Office Minister, Damien Green, Labour's Shadow Employment Minister, Chris Bryant. From UKIP, one of the party's leading candidates for this year's European elections, Janice Atkinson. The Daily Telegraph columnist, Christina Adone. And the Labour peer, broadcaster and Professor of Science and Society at Imperial College London, Robert Winston. Good. First question, Max Bell, please.
Why does it take flooding to hit the southeast of England before the Westminster Village notice or even care?
Damien Green.
I think that's half fair. I think a lot of it is...
Which bit?
Well, when you say the Westminster Village, it's certainly true that 24-hour news channels found it easier to get to the Thames Valley than they did to, say, the Somerset levels. But the truth is that the spread of the floods and the incessant nature of the bad weather has just made this a more important and bigger emergency as the weeks have passed. We now know that we've had the wettest period for 250 years. So it's not surprising that the various authorities that are dealing with it are having to catch up around the country. And that's why we've now got schemes to help not just householders, but separate schemes to help farmers, rate relief for businesses and so on, because this is a very serious emergency in large parts of the country. And people need and deserve that help, and that's why the army have come in, and obviously the police are doing a good job, as they always do, and getting those...
But Max's point is different. It's that this has only happened because the flooding's in the southeast, isn't that right?
No, you're absolutely right. Here in Scunthorpe, we've got both the River Trent and the River Humber, which are extremely liable to flooding. Back in December, villages barely 5 miles down the road hundreds of people had to be evacuated. There are members of the audience here who had to raise thousands of pounds because they weren't getting any help. There was no news coverage. Nobody cared. There weren't any statements. There wasn't anybody going around in wellies looking daft. If it's not within 10 miles of London, they don't care. The severity...
Do you agree with that at the back?
I'd like to quote some figures to the panel, please, in relation to flooding historically in the UK. There's a blog currently on with Paul Hudson that presents North West weather. He has quoted that in 2007 there were 23,500 homes flooded in the UK, and last year in the Yorkshire and Humber region there were 66,000 homes flooded, and you can compare that to the Somerset levels, which apparently 40 houses were flooded. I understand that there are plenty of other properties that were cut off, and I understand that in comparison to the south of England currently, that pales into insignificance.
All right. But you think that... OK. Just Brian.
To be honest...
You've heard the number of people complaining about the way that they were treated.
To be honest, I'd be spitting with fury if I lived up here, because today it's announced that the people who were flooded in December are going to get the same money that was announced by David Cameron earlier this week, that is going to people in the Thames Valley and in Somerset. But why didn't that happen in December? In 2007, there was major flooding, as the lady just referred to at the back there. Major flooding in Hull. We had a scheme up in place in 2 weeks. It's 2 months that we've been talking about here, and longer in relation to the North East. And I remember when I was first elected in 2001, we had terrible flooding in the Rhondda, in 2 very small areas, and it was because basically the local authority there hadn't cleaned out the various water channels for a long time. There were bricks and all sorts of stuff in there, and that had built up. That meant that the water built up behind. And secondly, because the pumping station was frankly Victorian, and I get really depressed that we still talk about Isengard Kingdom Brunel's engineering and wanting to protect that. And what about modern engineering? Why are we still relying on Victorian engineering?
Let's go back to the point. You attacked the government, in effect, and everybody here was critical of the government for doing nothing in December. The £5,000 people are now getting as a result of what happened in the Thames Valley. Why wasn't it offered here?
It was, as I remember, the local council actually set up a compensation scheme straight away, which was very good and very sensible. And I think, I mean, I quite take the point. I remember at the time thinking, why is this not being reported? And the truth was, as I remember, it coincided with the death of Nelson Mandela, and the entire world media decamped to South Africa. So actually, I completely agree. It was certainly underreported.
Okay. You sit up there on the right. Yeah.
I think there's a serious lack of planning for flooding. There was, I think, David Cameron. The reason that he had no involvement for maybe 6 to 8 weeks was because he was letting the guys on the ground get into some kind of order as to what they were going to do with the floods. You know, for a start, people say, "What's David Cameron going to do? What is he going to do? Build a wall around the country?" You know, there were 60-foot waves crashing in on some of those beaches. We can't stop those kind of floods. Well, we're talking about groundwater now that's coming up from the water table. We can't prevent those kind of floods. That's going to come up. We've got that much rain coming down. And when I refer to the lack of planning, is it not now about time that the firefighters were used as a statutory obligation to respond to floods? Because at the moment they're responding out of the goodwill and using parts of the budget that are there for other activities.
Christina, you answer?
Well, I agree that there's not very much David Cameron can do except for wear wellies and, you know, go around for a photo op. But there is such a thing as the Environmental Agency. And what I'd like to point out to those of you who are very cross about the North and lack of activity, lack of support here, I have friends I have in-laws in Somerset and friends who are farmers in the Somerset levels. And they were calling the Environmental Agency in December before Christmas and saying, look, the dredging of the rivers, Parrett and Tone, must happen now because we can see, you know, everybody's predicting a really bad winter. We can see what's going to happen. And the Environmental Agency said, no, it's not really necessary. So I think that Cameron himself, well, what could he do? But there's a regulatory body there. It's the Environmental Agency. Why were they so inactive? Why were they not responding to people who were calling and saying, we've lived here a long time, we know what is about to happen, let's not, you know, let's not dilly-dally.
But we hear now that we hear now that dredging of the rivers would actually not benefit the people.
Well, not just the dredging.
It's just going to move the problem further down the stream.
But hang on a second. David Green, just comment on this, because you will remember that Mr. Pickles, Eric Pickles, the Community Secretary, said exactly what Christina Adone is saying. I apologise, I'm really sorry, we took the advice of what we thought. We thought we were dealing with experts, referring to the environment.
Yeah, and 10,000 staff.
Was that right? Is that the feeling in government, that you were let down by the environment?
Yeah, I mean, the feeling very strong.
Or let down by Eric Pickles, one or the other.
No. It's that there is clearly a crisis which we need to sort out. And clearly...
Yeah, but just about the Pickles. Let's just stick with the Pickles.
No, I mean...
He was very clear. He went on television and said, we thought we were dealing with experts. He criticised the Environment Agency for being responsible.
My understanding, and I don't intend to become... this growing profession of armchair hydrologists, who the nation is now full of people. Just as whenever we go to war, we all become armchair generals, we're now all becoming experts on river flows and hydrology. And I'm conscious that I'm not an expert. But my understanding is that in the Somerset levels, dredging might have helped a bit, but actually wouldn't have been a magic bullet. And in other places, such as the Thames Valley, there are so many locks and weirs and so on that you don't actually alter the flow very much by dredging. So it's different in different areas.
Let's go back to this issue of whether it's because it was in the southeast that the government acted. You sit up there, the second row from the back.
Is it not the fact that it's highlighting the north-south divide again, and there's far more Conservative seats down south than we have up north, and that's why there's an awful more money down there?
Well, I don't think it's a political issue. I think we're missing the point entirely, actually, to tell you the truth. You know, in a way, and I hate to say this because it's a terrible thing to have your house inundated like this wherever you live, but in a way, this is a good thing because it should be an awful warning to what's going to happen increasingly in the future. You know, virtually all sensible scientific opinion is clear that we are undergoing climate change, that there's going to be increasingly chaotic weather around the world, overheating in some places like Australia, flooding in places like Bangladesh, which will kill thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. And indeed, you know, even in Britain, the Thames barrier is now actually inadequate for the purpose. Perhaps it would be good if Westminster were flooded, I don't know. But actually, quite seriously, you know, it is shocking to blame any minister or indeed the Environmental Agency. The Environmental Agency certainly has been underfunded, that's very clear, and therefore it couldn't respond in the way it should have done. I think it's regrettable that Chris Smith didn't visit the places earlier as its boss. I think that was a big mistake. But, you know, in a sense, one has to say that really, you know, 1,000 years ago we had King Canute, and in a sense David Cameron's looking a bit like King Canute, you know, looking at the waves which are inevitably going to come in. The sea level has risen by 20 centimetres. We know that there is measured heating. We know that it's changing. And we need to do something about the next generation. For a long time now, scientists have been saying we must look at flooding. It's going to be one of the most serious consequences of heating. It's not just simply that crops dry up or there's a shortage of water. In some parts of the world, there will be far too much water. And we're seeing that, I think, at the moment. And, of course, the trouble is we can't prove that that's the case. But the situation is that now, in a place like Lincolnshire, you're desperately vulnerable. I mean, you've already said that. You know, and one of the problems, of course, is that we know from history that you cannot beat nature. If you take reclaimed land, nature may well try and reclaim it again, and that's a big problem.
Let's, let me take... There's so many hands up, I don't know where to go. Go to the person there. Yes, you. And then I come to you.
I'd just like to come back to the original question, and I appreciate everything that Lord Winston said, but my concern is that nobody did come up to this part of the world, and on the night of December the 5th, 120 homes were devastated in one tiny village. I wonder, can any of you name that tiny village?
Janice Atkinson.
The reason they went to the South East in the first time, because that's where the Tory heartlands...
I can, but I've got it written down. So it would be cheating.
Very simple question. Please, could you name the village?
But nobody would name it, because nobody, if you're right that nobody knew it was happening, nobody knew it was happening. And that 700,000 chickens died in a shed.
Absolutely. 750.
And one of the hotels closed because and still hasn't been able to open again.
So you can name it?
I can't, I'm afraid. I did read earlier, but and I do remember that in December there were debates in the House of Commons, actually they weren't reported anywhere, because a lot of the local MPs, of course, were raising these issues.
Yeah. Let's leave South Ferriby and come back to the main question.
We have an environmental agency. They are one of the most... They are the largest populated... They are the largest employer of the whole of Europe. So what were they doing? They weren't dredging the Thames because they're frightened of upsetting the odd newt or the odd mollusk down there. No, it is actually right, Robert. It really is. And we've got David Cameron promising us money. Oh, we've got a blank cheque, an open cheque. We've got £1.2 trillion worth of debt. Where's that money going to come from? But this government and the governments before this present coalition, the Tory-led coalition, are spending money on useless wind farms. £1,000 million has been spent on useless wind farms coming up on the train. Now, just a few miles from here, you've got a very rich landowner, and he's invested in hundreds of the wind farms. And the reason why is because there's vested interest in this. There's become an industry in the climate change industry. Now, that man is creaming off hundreds of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money. That's low-income families, that's pensioners. And that man is David Cameron's father-in-law, and I think that's absolutely disgusting. If we had invested in flood defences and dredged the rivers, then we wouldn't be in this mess. And I would say to you, the reason why that it's not been reported of what happened to the people up here, because of the London-centric media and because the Tory heartlands, and they're all running around in their Hunter Wellies in the Somerset levels trying to shore up their votes and not shore up your rivers.
You're not blaming, like other UKIP members did, gay marriage for the God's retribution for the floods, are you?
No, I don't think so.
You've pulled back from that position.
I've never held that position.
I thought
never
it was never
UKIP's
official.
No, but he was a Tory, and what's interesting about that?
He was a Tory,
he was a Tory. He was a Tory councillor. This man was a Tory councillor,
you can never tell which party
and he was always spouting this type of rubbish. But as soon as he stepped over to UKIP, and all of a sudden, you know, the old parties are all over us. Chris's party has actually got a unit that's dealing with UKIP at the moment, but they should actually be dealing with the policies.
All right.
Their policies that affect people.
Can I return to flooding? There'll be people watching this programme worried that their house is going to flood, so I think it's a serious issue that deserves serious attention. And I just disagree flatly with Janet about wind farms and those who clap saying they're a terrible waste of time. Because if you take Robert seriously, who's, I think, the most distinguished scientist on this panel, and if, therefore, you think it is likely or even very possible that climate change is caused by man-made emissions and that climate change is contributing to these terrible events that we're seeing, then actually having renewable energy to generate our electricity is a good thing. And it's a good thing that we're moving down that route.
I agree with that. But I also want to disagree with another point, which is I don't think dredging is always the answer. There are places where, as Richard Benyon, who was formerly a Conservative minister, I'm going to praise the Conservative minister. I think he was a very good environment minister. And one of the things that yes, exactly. And one of the things that he was saying earlier this week was there are many places in this country where if you dredged, you would be doing dramatic damage. It'd be completely a mistake.
Yes, you said you didn't want to set yourself up as a professional.
I didn't say that. It was him that said that.
You don't mind. You don't mind.
I'm not setting myself up. I'm just saying that I think you have to have different responses in different places, and that's why
But it's not just dredging. It's also maintenance of the hedges.
Exactly.
It was maintenance of the plains. I mean, it wasn't just dredging.
All right, let's hear from some more members of our audience. And Robert, I'll come to you in a minute. Yes.
Lord Smith said that government funding is only available if you get 800% economic return on money spent.
£8 for the pound.
£8 for the pound. And that's probably why the Thames Valley easily meets that criteria, whereas we in the rural communities don't. We get 50% less government funding than urban communities, and even in this situation we get kicked in the teeth and say, because you don't give us enough return on investment, you don't deserve help.
It's not...
You sat there. Hold on. Man with the beard there, you. Yes.
Well, given the risk of flooding and that very likely there will be... we can't guarantee funding in the future, do you think it might be negligent or irresponsible of local authorities to grant permission for housing to be developed on floodplains?
You think that ought to... Well, you think that should stop, or it should be?
Well, I think there may be. You may have to design. You might be able to design housing to be able to be not so affected by flooding.
Okay, and the lady in the front here, you.
I was just going to say our council's about to give planning permission for 60,000 homes actually on a floodplain. What's going to happen if they get flooded in the future? Are they going to be able to get insurance?
But the council presumably knows it's floodplain. That it's
they do. It's underwater every winter because of the snow.
Every winter?
And the rain. Yes, you go down the field behind the back of Tesco's.
Where here, right here
yes.
in Scunthorpe?
Yeah.
Okay. And you sat at the very back?
Yeah, I mean, North Links Council actually, or certainly parts of the North Links Council, are not really keen on that. But there's actually very little planning criteria that we can avoid doing it. Just going back
to... Are you on the council?
Yes, I am a councillor, yeah.
What, and you say you can't say no because you get appealed and it's turned down?
The appeals so far this year have cost us in excess of £400,000 when we've tried to stop them. That's not for flooding. There's other things. So we try to stop things. But going back to the flooding in Ferriby and Barrowhaven, I was actually down there. I got my feet wet. And was there for 5 days afterwards trying to help people. It was an absolute tragedy. I came across a guy in a foot of water in his slippers who joyfully told me, he was very stoic, joyfully told me I could have done without this. I'm actually just come back from hospital. I've had my first chemotherapy. It was devastating for those people. However, I do feel, and I'll not be popular, I've got to give a sense of proportion. In 1953, when the flood defences were not as good as they are now, and we were flooded by a flood that was not as serious as the one that we've just had, 300 people were killed, 300 plus people. Thankfully, nobody was seriously injured or killed, apart from 75,000 chickens, 45 sheep, and a dog. Now, in looking at it, and I'm going to give a bit of a plug to the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency in Barton invested a lot of money because we have a haven that comes in, which was the old harbour into Barton. And I was looking over that haven. They did a big civil engineering job there, and it was within 6 inches of the top of it. I remember the grass bank. I was head and shoulders above the grass bank, and I was only on tiptoes just looking over the actual flood defence.
You look as if you're about 6'6" tall anyway.
I am, yeah. And we would have lost 1,000 houses in Barton if that defence hadn't been there. As it was, we lost 2. Tragic, and I've met both the families, and I've been to the families at Barrowhaven with the local MP.
And that's true in other parts of the country as well. We spent £2.4 billion. The previous government spent lots of money after the 2007 floods. So
you cut the money.
No, we haven't. We're spending more.
You cut the money.
Let's not have a partisan discussion, Chris. There are people whose lives are under threat.
But if you don't spend enough money, but if you don't spend enough money, you're not going to be able to maintain the resilience for the future.
But gentlemen, the shocking thing is, I was there, and there was nothing we could do when that flood came over, apart from run away, just like in Bangladesh. The advantage we had, that the next day and the following days, we had the infrastructure to go in there and help people, and we had enough people in the area to also help people.
We must move on, I think, to another question, because
I've got 6 solutions to the problem.
You've got 6 solutions, but it will take 60 seconds.
Very quickly.
Right,
very quickly. We need to do this. I mean, we're looking so short term, but in the longer term, I think we have to invest in nuclear power. I think we have to understand carbon capture. I think we need to look at renewable energy, which will include wind farms, though you have a problem, of course, on this coast, moving them in from the sea. We all need to save energy and save water from our taps. Simple things like that. We are all extremely wasteful. I think it's not just housing, because housing brings roads, it brings schools, it brings hospitals, it brings concrete in gardens, so there's no runoff. But most importantly of all, and we're not doing this well, we need to engage globally, because unless we do that, we're not going to solve the problem.
Okay. So, do join in tonight's debate by text or Twitter. Our hashtag BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time. If you're texting 83981, the red button says what others are saying. Stuart Moore, please. Stuart Moore.
Are the British establishment trying to scare the Scots into voting to stay in the UK by refusing to let them keep the pound?
What's your view?
Well, I think Scotland are entitled to the pound as much as England are, as we are down here. We all share it, and I just think, for once, you see, it's very rare. All the parties seem to be coming together for once. It'd be nice to see it more often. But the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, well, should I say the coalition, are all now coming together to, it looks to me, to bully the Scots into voting to stay with the UK.
Christina O'Doney.
Well, it did look
this
like
unity,
that.
Is it bullying?
It did look like that when you have Danny Alexander, George Osborne and Ed Balls all, ganging up. And as you said, a unity, a political unity that the floods somehow didn't give rise to. But I also have to say, I think that the Scots are not going to put up with it. And the Scots are already used to having a pound that most of my shopkeepers in London won't accept. So they're not going to be scared of being, bullied over the currency. Whether in the end it is a good thing for the more serious question of, will Scotland break away, be independent, will Holyrood detach itself from Westminster? I'm not so convinced. I think a united kingdom is a better kingdom.
Robert Winston, you're a politician as well as a scientist. You watch these things in the House of Lords. Do you think this is an attempt to scare the Scots?
It's really interesting.
Or is it a serious... do they mean it?
My immediate reaction is that, David Cameron is being remarkably altruistic, isn't he? Because, of course, it's in his interest in some ways that Scotland does secede, because that would... Don't you think so?
Well, make it easier...
No, I disagree.
You don't think,
Sorry.
You think that we lose Labour seats in Parliament. That's the issue. But having said that, I mean, to be serious for a moment, I think one of the concerns that I have, I think we're right to band together and say, look, you can't have bits of the United Kingdom that you want to have and not other bits. The fact is, if you have the pound, you have responsibility for interest rates, you have responsibility for currency control. And if the Scotlands really want to go it alone, then it's up to them to have their own border controls and their own currency. I don't think it's going to be easy for them to join the euro, and it probably won't be in their interests. So the question is, what currency will they have? Certainly not the dollar. Maybe they should have the Bitcoin. I don't know.
You sit at the back. Do you think the establishment in Westminster is trying to bully the Scots into voting no?
I think they've played right into Alex Salmond and the SNP's hands, actually. I think they've just stirred a hornet's nest up there north of the border, and I think, it's going to backfire against them, and I think the Scots will vote yes for independence now. It's that big.
Simply because they feel bullied?
Yes, absolutely. The Scots, we know what they're like. They're rebellious, They don't particularly like us, and especially not the Tories. I was up there a few days ago, and, they're really, a Tory government. I think the next government will be Labour, but I think that will be too late. I think being in September, they'll vote independence for sure.
I'll come back to you in a moment. Damien Green, do you think there's an animosity towards the Tory party in particular, which makes this a counterproductive thing to have done?
It's not our heartlands, but I disagree with sort of almost all of that, actually, to be fair. Robert's right, actually, and I'll make myself unpopular by speaking in praise of politicians and political parties. Everyone assumes political parties are only in it for their own narrow self-interest. It is clearly in the partisan interest of the Conservative Party for Scotland and its dozens of Labour MPs and its one Conservative MP to break away. We are campaigning as hard as we can, absolutely united party, to keep Scotland in the United Kingdom, because we think that's right for the United Kingdom and we think it's right for Scotland. So anyone who says that politicians are only in it for themselves should consider that. And Robert, as a member of the Labour Party, is very good.
But the Prime Minister hasn't been up. The Prime Minister is not going up to Scotland.
He is. The Cabinet's going up to Scotland shortly.
But he's not going to debate with the Scottish National.
Well, and nor should he. Because only the Scots have a vote. So the debate in Scotland needs to be between the two campaigns in Scotland, between Alex Salmond and Alistair Darling. And I don't think the Scots will feel bullied by this. And I also, as it happens, think the Scots will be far too sensible to vote to separate from the rest of the United Kingdom, because it's in Scotland's interest as well. Because this is a reality that if you are a different country, you can't say, but we're going to have a say in your currency. And you can have different sovereign countries that come together and share a currency, and we've seen it in the euro, and that has caused a lot of strains, particularly for smaller countries. And in effect, the Alex Salmond plan would be to impose that kind of thing on everyone in the rest of Britain as well. We would have two different countries trying to run a currency. And it's much more difficult to run that in the interest of both countries. And I think it's fundamentally undemocratic, because if you want to do that sort of thing, which has a huge effect on everyone in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, then England, Wales and Northern Ireland should have a vote on this as well. And of course we don't.
But what kind of vote would you give England, Wales and Northern Ireland? One that prevented Scotland becoming independent if it chose to?
Well, if Scotland
go to war,
Scotland can vote on independence. What I'm saying is that if what Scotland is saying is that we want to run your currency as well, then clearly we should have a say as well, only in those circumstances.
All right, go back to you, sir. Yes.
I'm sitting on the fence, really, although it was my question. I'm sitting on the fence, and as a half-Scot, my mother's Scottish, my dad's English, I live in England, but I can understand where the Scots are coming from if they do vote to go independent, because they don't vote for Conservatives in Scotland, but yet are always run by Conservatives. That, if I was living up in Scotland, that would be my reason to go independent, irrespective of any other idea.
Janice Axon, what do you think of today's action, all three main parties, and UKIP as well, yes, or not?
Well, no, I absolutely agree.
UKIP said, endorsed the thing about
we can't keep the pound. We can't keep the pound. He actually sees his future in Europe, so let him have the euro, and we'll see how far he gets with that. We actually believe that we're stronger together, we're better together. But when they have their referendum, and aren't they lucky they've had a referendum, because we're being denied a referendum. Dave has agreed to give them a referendum, but Carstein Dave won't give us a referendum on Europe.
You can have one.
I think we'll get one. Well, no, Carstein Dave, we don't actually believe Carstein Dave on that one because he's promised it before. But, do you know what, at least they're having their referendum. And when we have our referendum, and I hope we do in 2017, and we'll have another referendum next year, we'll have a parliamentary referendum, and it will come down to the economy and it will come down to jobs. Those are the two main things that people worry about. So they will have their say, and I think the Scots are a canny lot. They will actually vote to stay in because together we're stronger.
OK. You, sir.
What currency Scotland can use.
Sorry, start again.
When they're on about what currency Scotland can use, would they meet the criteria for entering the euro? Has anyone ever looked at that?
Not immediately.
No. Chris Bryant.
I don't know the specific answer to that question, but I almost certainly wouldn't be immediately. There's no guarantee, incidentally, they'd be allowed to join the European Union. But I note, sir, that your name is Stuart. Obviously, a Scot, you know, there's quite a lot of Scot in you. Yes. And to be honest, there's a lot of Scot in me as well, though my brother always used to say that he was half Welsh, half English, half Scottish, which he wasn't very good at maths. But I just feel we're all part of the same thing, aren't we? Emotionally, I disagree. I don't think it will boil down to economics and things like that. I think it will boil down to the emotion of it all.
And what about the tactic of Osborne going to Edinburgh and his views being endorsed by Ed Balls, for instance?
I think you have got to lay out the facts. You can't have an independent country that is where you're expecting England then to prop up the banks, the Scottish banks, if the banks go under.
And where's
which is
the
what the Bank of England presumably would have to do.
We've got £1.2 trillion worth of debt.
Exactly.
How are we going to divide
all of those,
that?
and so
the Barnet formula,
I think it's perfectly legitimate to simply lay out the facts, and that's all that's happened today. And I hope you're wrong, sir. The Scots I know are taking this the whole issue very seriously. It will be an enormous step into the dark, I think. And this is just one of the many, many issues that they're going to be facing.
Just a couple of points. You say over there, and then I'll come to you. Yes.
Didn't the Bank of England prop up the Irish banks when they went under?
They did, didn't they?
Yes.
They did.
£7 billion. That's
right.
Is that right? When the Irish banks went under, we said it was in our interest to keep Ireland afloat.
Which it was. Yes. Ireland is a very, very significant trading partner.
Wouldn't Scotland be in the same position?
Well, there's a difference between propping up someone's banks and actually allowing them to run your currency. That's a very significant.
And the other point is interest rates, of course. That Scotland would, if Scotland wants to retain the English pound, as it were, and still have a say on interest rates, I think that would be inappropriate. And the point about devaluation as well.
Okay.
It's just that bad economics to say we want to be independent, but keep the old currency.
Right. Last point from you.
The SNP still seem to be in denial about today's decision. When are they actually going to shut up whinging and start deciding what they're going to do about it? Because the policy isn't going to change.
So you think it's up to the SNP, but they just say this is
still believes that we will allow them to keep the pound.
Yes.
They've been told we will not allow them to keep the pound.
But they don't believe it. They believe they will be allowed to. So what do you do then? It's a standoff.
And come up with Plan B very quickly.
They don't necessarily have to. They just say don't believe them. They don't mean it.
Well, he can say what he likes, but
at which point the Scottish people will decide as they will in a referendum.
Let's go on to another question. That's good. Linda Lewis, please. Linda Lewis.
Can a smoking ban in cars with children realistically be enforced?
Can it be enforced? This agreed in the House of Commons. legislation to come before, the detailed legislation banning smoking in cars. Can it realistically be enforced? Janice, what do you think?
Of course it can't. But do you know, is it wrong to smoke in a car with children? Absolutely. Now, I'm a libertarian, but the only anti-libertarian streak I have in me, I'm so anti-smoking. I really hate smoking. I grew up in a house where I had 2 smokers. Actually, it made me ill. Both of my parents smoked in the car.
How do you get on with Nigel Farage in that case? Never stop smoking.
We don't, he's outside, I'm inside. Yeah. He's 2 cars, yeah. No, we don't have smoking in our cars. But
we don't have children either.
But there's a serious point here. It's how far do you go? So we all know that if you're smoking or you're drinking in pregnancy, then that's very harmful to the baby. So is the next step down the line that actually we make that a criminal offence? Or when mums go to Iceland and they start loading up their cars with full-fat, ready-made meals, do we make that an illegal act? And actually, if you take this area as well, you think about policing and the strains that are on our policing at the moment. In this area, you've got violent crime rising. Your car crime is flatlining. I'd actually prefer the police up here to be getting on with the solving serious crime and stopping violent crime.
Are you in favour of a legal ban on smoking in cars with children or not?
I prefer it not to be a criminalised offence. I think we should be educating people more. And Damien, tell me, how are we going to police this?
OK, Robert, I'll come to you. Robert Winston, before we come to that, is it proven that smoking near children gives children all the diseases that they live?
Very much the issue. I mean, I'm rather proud of the fact that this was an amendment that started in the House of Lords, and I, amongst others, voted in favour of this ban. We recognise that it's difficult to enforce and might be impossible. But to be honest, the evidence that it really damages children in general, passive smoking, isn't quite as good as is made out. It probably does do, but there isn't long-term evidence to clearly demonstrate that. But I would say that really smoking in a vehicle when you're driving it under any circumstances, with or without a child, is dangerous. Because...
You just ban smoking in cars, period.
Because the moment you're distracted, you drop the cigarette, it's on your trousers or your skirt, there's a smell of burning, and you're distracted, you're then a danger to other road users. And if the child at the back is fractious as well, you're doubly dangerous to other road users. So I really think that's a real problem.
But it's interesting because you're not saying it's a danger to children's lungs, and you're saying it's actually bad practice when you're driving.
I'm saying it probably is bad for children's lungs. Many doctors are absolutely certain it's bad for children's lungs, but actually the clear published evidence isn't quite as good as was stated in Parliament. It's certainly not good to smoke around children for lots of reasons, not just the damage to their lungs, but the habit and copying children mimic their elders. But I think, whether it's restrictive or not, and it is a law that's difficult to enforce, nowadays, with photography on motorways and roadways generally, it's very easy to actually pick up people who are smoking in cars. You could actually see that. And I think if you are at risk of prosecution, it may not be such a massive amount of police time after all.
It's more surveillance, it's more Big Brother watching us.
We are surveyed. We are surveyed in our cars.
Well, I'm not saying that's right.
Damien Green, you're responsible for the police and for criminal justice. What was your view about this ban?
I think that smoking in cars in front of your children is disgusting and stupid, and you shouldn't do it, mostly, I think, for the reason of setting an example. I take Robert's view on medical evidence. I was interested in that, but you shouldn't do it. It's a bad thing to do. But I voted against the ban, and I voted against the ban for 2 reasons. One, because I'm the police minister, and therefore I spend a lot of my time worrying that the police are doing what most people want them to be doing most of the time, and so just piling new criminal offences onto the statute book, meaning that the police have to enforce them, means that whether it's a huge amount of time or a small amount of time, that means less police time available for stopping violent crime and doing all that kind of thing. And also because I think there are a large range of activities that I personally disapprove of and wish people didn't do, and certainly don't want them to do anywhere near me, or that society as a whole doesn't like people to do, but which we still shouldn't make criminal offences, because I think the state interferes too much in our lives.
Yes, I'll go back to you. Yes. The lady there in the second row at the back who asked the question. Yeah,
I'm wholeheartedly in favour of the ban, and even if it can't be enforced, any small steps that make people think about their actions, I think, has to be really good. But what I'm slightly cynical about is the government that's trying to bring it in. I mean, we're aware that it's down to education. They're the government that is trying to close down the Sure Start children's centres, where the root of education for families is.
OK. And you, who I nearly called on and didn't quite. Yes.
Well, I'd quite clearly like to reiterate that point. Surely if just because it is hard to implement, surely does that mean that you shouldn't implement it? Because it would just make people think twice before they smoke if a policeman is to see them, and maybe they might get caught. So the problem is not to obviously implement it. The problem is you just need to make people think twice before they start smoking.
Can I answer that very directly and very quickly? Yeah. The problem is, if assuming this, and I'm a parliamentarian, I was cut off before I say, as a parliamentarian, I respect the will of Parliament. I was on the losing side of this vote, so we will go ahead with it. But the idea that you pass something into law and then it doesn't matter whether it's enforced or not is not true, because if in 3 years' time nobody has been prosecuted for smoking in their car, then two things will happen. One, people will start doing it again, and secondly, people will think they're passing laws that they don't enforce, and that brings the rule of law into disrepute, and that's a bad thing in itself as well.
But I just say, first of all, the law presently requires people seated in the back seat of a car to wear a seatbelt. I've never seen anybody be prosecuted for not doing that, but I think now many more people wear a seatbelt in the back of their car than used to before we changed the law. So it must be a good change in the law. And secondly, I think probably, in my constituency, former mining constituency, lots of people had really bad chest complaints from working in the mines, but actually the single most important thing I did as an MP for the health of people in my constituency was voting to ban smoking in public places, because it means fewer people smoke, fewer people will die of smoking related illnesses. And the third thing I'd say is I remember my mum. She smoked like a chimney. She never stopped, all day, every day. She smoked. The worst place for me was in the car, because it was in a really small place. She would pretend that the cigarette was outside the window, but frankly, it always managed to blow straight back into the car, and I hated it. And it's a sort of set the children free moment, I think.
OK. The gentleman up there on the right.
I fully agree with Lord Winston about smoking in cars. I mean, people have been fined for eating apples, chocolate bars and things like that. If you drop an apple, it's not a problem. I used to smoke when I was a lot younger, and I've dropped cigarettes in cars and blind panic sets in. So I think it's not a bad idea at all.
Christina O'Donnell.
You know what? I don't have a car. I used to smoke. I no longer smoke. But I still didn't like this. I just don't want laws telling me what I can do or not do with my children in the car that we don't have. I feel really uncomfortable with it. And, you know, I think that parents, yes, of course, we must promote, you know, anti-smoking education, not legislation, but education. Tell parents again and again, don't smoke when you're pregnant. Don't smoke, you know, anywhere near your child. Passive smoking is bad. But a law to do this, it's as if the government were telling us that the government is a better parent than we are. And do you know what? Yeah. Do you know what? I don't think it is. When we have children in care of the government, those children are not doing well. Care homes are terrible places. Those reform institutions where young offenders go, they're terrible, they're abysmal. That's where self-harming youths and suicides are, you know, skyrocketing. I don't think government is always best when it comes to our children. I think we are. Now, what do you want?
Thank you, Christina. The law also presently says that if children are seated under a certain age in the back of a car, they have to be in a children's seat. Would you remove that legal requirement? Because that's the logic of your position.
No, it's not the logic of my position.
It is, because it's the government telling people how to carry their children in the back of the car.
There's certain room for legal interference. But let's not interfere at every step, in every second of our lives.
What about a ban on children smoking in front of their parents in the car?
I wish we could do that.
No mention of that. The gentleman in the tie, who looks as if he would qualify for that if he was smoking.
Christina's point.
Yes.
Is the slight loss of liberty imposed by the government not justified in the safety which is ensured of the children in the cars?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I still don't buy it. I don't buy it.
Okay.
But you look like my stepson when you said that.
Last point from you up there, that man in the blue shirt. Oh, sorry.
I just don't understand why anyone would defend the right to be able to smoke in front of a child in the car.
Okay. Take a question now, please. We've got 10 minutes left or so from Paul Foster.
Should the UK take its lead from the Swiss when renegotiating its relationship with Europe?
Yes, Switzerland had a vote. Switzerland is not part of the EU, but it has very close and complicated relationships with the EU, which involves accepting a lot of EU practices, including free crossing of borders, immigration, taking up jobs. And they had a referendum and decided that they weren't going to do this any longer. And they're going to have to renegotiate it with the EU, and nobody quite knows how it's going to turn out. But should the UK take a lead? What do you think? Do you think we should have a referendum on that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, in UK we believe that we should have a referendum on an awful lot of things.
What do you think of the Swiss action there?
Oh,
an example for us?
Absolutely brilliant, because they have control over their borders. They have control over their financial services industry. They have control over their tax. They're rich. Oh, to be like the Swiss. But there's a serious point here.
Is that not a serious point?
Brussels won't allow them to keep that vote. Brussels will overturn it because actually it's against the single market. And part of being part of the single market is open borders, completely open borders, uncontrolled immigration. So they voted against it. And just like the French were told and the Irish were told, when they voted no, they didn't want certain things, then they were told to go back and get the right vote. Now, Viviane Reding, one of the EU commissioners, was over in the week, and she thinks that we're a bit thick to have our own referendum because actually you don't understand the real issues facing us at the moment. And she's saying also that 70% of our laws come from Brussels. So if you were the Swiss, why would you want 70% of your laws to come from Brussels?
Well, hang on,
because basically it's made them redundant, or maybe that's a good thing, and you can have a referenda on the things that you want. So to be like the Swiss, absolutely.
But the Swiss have accepted a lot of the EU legislation, haven't they?
Well,
in order to get the trade.
They have to, yeah.
But you think that you think they won't be allowed to opt out of this? In other words, the EU will say...
It's fundamental.
So the EU is going to say, if you do that, you're out of the deal.
Yes.
We close the deal.
Yeah,
and you'd like to see Switzerland close the deal?
Oh, if Switzerland want to walk away, but do you know what?
Right,
Norway are testing it now as well. So I think you'll see a sort of, a complete waterfall effect here, and I hope they do, because the people need to take back power, and the sovereign parliaments need to take back
Chris
power.
Bryant.
Oh, to be like the Swiss. I really don't want to be like the Swiss. For a start, they have to implement everything that the EU comes up with, and they don't even get to sit at the table to decide on what the rules are. So it's an absolute nonsense to say that we should be like the Swiss. And no, I don't want to say that Europeans shouldn't be allowed to come into this country, and that there should be some kind of cap on the number of Europeans that come into this country from other members of the European Union. Because guess which is the country that has most nationals living elsewhere in Europe? The United Kingdom. 2.6 million Brits living elsewhere. Now, yes, some of those are retired people who are wealthy and own their own homes in Spain, but some of them are over 65 and using the NHS for free, something that they never contributed to. So I believe passionately in Europe, because I think in the end, I know some people dismiss and they say that the only reason that we've had peace in a continent that has been at war historically for centuries and centuries is because of NATO. I don't believe that. I think it's because people sit round a table and negotiate their way to peace these days, and that's partly because of the European Union. And I tell you one other thing. When was it that Britain became so pathetic that we said, oh, we're just worried about other people coming here. We're not worried about what opportunities there might be for us to make our way in France and Germany and Spain and Italy, to make big businesses in other countries. What's the country that invests most in this country? France. We should seize hold of our membership of the European Union and say, yes, we believe in it, we're committed to it, we're not going to renege on it because it's been good for this country.
Isn't this just a matter, though, that the Swiss have actually showed us what true democracy is? It's the will of the people, not the will of European unelected politicians.
What do you make of the UKIP position?
No, you
are you a supporter of UKIP? Are you?
No, I'm afraid I'm not. But I also think that there's something else that is much more sinister that has motivated the Swiss. And it's this fear, this alarm about the other. And it's the person who comes into your country and is taking your job, is taking your benefits, is taking your services. And this is what appeals to UKIP, because they have the same narrative. And I think that you can protect your identity, you can protect your legacy, your heritage, without making other cultures into a threat to your happiness. And I think when we are sitting here in Scunthorpe and we're thinking about, the biggest employer around here, Tata Steel, it's Indian. Let's not forget, immigrants of all kinds are either giving us incredible opportunities like Tata Steel or working their somethings off. And guess what? Claiming less than 45% of the benefits and tax credits that the average domestic worker does. So I think there's something really sinister, and it's not the cuckoo clock, it's a kind of inherent xenophobia. And this is what appeals to UKIP, and it's what appeals to the Swiss.
You were shaking your head when Christina was talking. You don't agree with her?
Yeah, if you're referring to Viviane Reding's figures, she's using the figures about the amount of benefit being claimed by immigrants, not the percentage of immigrants claiming benefit.
What do you think of the... hang on a second, let's get into that. What do you think of the main issue?
The point isn't just about immigrants and migrants. It's also about us being able to make our own rules. It's about us not being dictated to by Brussels on all sorts of policies, such as human rights. We're not allowed to get rid of terrorists.
Which human right do you want to get rid of?
We want to be able to get rid of a terrorist that is a risk to our country. It's not just whether we can or whether we can't. We should be able to make that decision ourselves. We're being totally dictated to by Brussels.
That's the Human Rights Court, sir, is nothing to do with Brussels.
Human rights is just one part of it. There are so many parts to this, other than just the people coming to the country. We're just talking about that. There's so many other things that are involved with being in the EU.
And the Swiss set a good example in your view.
Absolutely.
By doing that. And do you agree with that? The woman there? Yes.
Well, my problem is that, of course, I'm not English, but I'm British. But the problem is that over here, with negative propaganda by politicians, people are too scared about any other nation but this island. Whoever comes in is an intruder. And that's not the fact. People come here to work and earn good living.
Absolutely.
And pay taxes.
Look, we in UKIP want the brightest and best from around the world. I'm actually quoted in the Hindustan Times to say I want the brightest and best from India and China. We have no problem with that. It's sheer numbers.
But the negative propaganda, excuse me, I have to finish this. But the negative propaganda, what it does is that even though I'm working as a doctor in the street, I'll still be called a packy.
Well, that's absolutely wrong, madam. You're very welcome to work here as a doctor.
That's the actual fact that no matter what I'm doing for the society, equally the society is doing for me. The baseline is that we are scared of each other.
Damien Green, you want to take issue with UKIP on this?
I do, because your policy at the last election was for a 5-year freeze for no immigration at all.
Absolutely.
For 5 years. Have you dropped that policy?
Yes, well, Right, I'm on the Policy Review Committee, so I know exactly what's happening. And when we've got our policies, we'll tell you. What we want is borders. No, because they don't have a policy on this. No, because you don't.
What do you mean, no? I was the immigration minister for 2.5 years.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And along with Chris, you just opened our borders.
That Britain benefits from immigration. It benefits from people coming to work in the health service.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. I agree.
What gives rise to the fear, which gives rise to UKIP and other parties, is when immigration is out of control.
Yes.
And 10 years ago in this country, immigration was out of control. If you try and change a society too fast, then people get worried, and that gives rise to unpleasant consequences. So that's why we've instituted systems of controls. That's why we have a cap on the number of work visas. That's why we've closed 700 bogus colleges, so that people can't come here pretending to be students when actually they're coming here to work. And it's a long haul, but the system is getting better, and controlled immigration is beneficial to this country.
What do you say to the man there in the centre, member of the audience, who said that the Swiss at least showed they're in control of their own policies and they have a vote on it and they decide, and that's democratic?
Well, so do we. I mean, all those things that I've just explained were passed through the British Parliament. They were put into power because we won a general election.
All right, and you there on the right.
I just want to know how you define who the brightest and the best are. Surely that's just opinion. No, you can't just say, oh, we're going to have the brightest and the best people here, because you cannot judge that.
Robert
Whether
Winston.
someone has a job as a doctor doesn't mean they're a wonderful person. I mean, not saying that doctors aren't wonderful people.
She may be.
You can't judge that.
Robert Winston.
We've hugely benefited from people like yourself over there as doctors in this country. But I'm a little bit concerned, Damien, about what you say. You know, you've just introduced the most restrictive immigration bill. And in particular, there's one area that's very, very of great concern, and that is the restriction on students coming into this country, which is an £11 billion industry, at least, if not more, given the IP. But having said that, let's come back to Switzerland. Perhaps we should come back to Switzerland.
Can I answer that point directly? Because what's happened is that the number of students has reduced because of all these bogus students. The number of university students coming into this country, which you and I both want to see, has increased. So look beneath the aggregate figures.
And the number of students coming from India and China has fallen by a third.
Okay. Robert, you have the conch, because we have 50 seconds left.
I mean, there's clear evidence that students are being put off to apply to universities, certainly in our main universities, like the Russell Group. There's no doubt we have the figures. All right. And it's massive. But we'll come back to Switzerland, because I really think what Janice is completely out of touch. Forgive me, you would not want to be like the Swiss. You know, they have a totally different system of government. First of all, there's part of Switzerland that would really like to be in the EU, for example, around Geneva. There's another part around Zurich that absolutely is implacably opposed to Europe. So that's a division. And secondly, of course, they have a multiplicity of little parliaments that have all sorts of referenda, which we would never have on insignificant subjects. And actually, most of the time, they don't really do much for really changing the Swiss mentality or the Swiss attitude. And one of their problems is that they haven't benefited from immigration in the way that we have. It's been quite clear that they haven't, and that's a major reason why I don't think we would want to be like the Swiss.
But 25% or more of Switzerland is immigrants.
Yeah, but I mean, you try and buy property in Switzerland. You try and deal with They have a huge problem with their currency, because it's massively valued, and I think they have very big problems.
All right, let's leave it there. We have to stop, I'm afraid, Chris. Our hour is up. Thank you all very much. Next week we're going to be in Swindon with Question Time, and we'll have the novelist Jeanette Winterson and the philosopher Roger Scruton on the panel. The week after that we're going to be in Newport in Wales. So if you'd like to come to either programme, Swindon or Newport, you can apply on our website. The address is on the screen there, as always, or you can ring 0330 123 9988. If you're listening to this on Radio 5 Live, the debate goes on Question Time Extra Time, as always. Look, I'd just like to thank our panel very much indeed, and all of you who came here to take part in this edition. Really great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. From Scunthorpe until next Thursday night. Good night.
Well, the flood debate continues next on BBC One. Even flood victim and magician Paul Daniels can't make the water disappear. And Hollywood actor Matthew Modine with Andrew Neil this week.
Surprising that the various authorities that are dealing with it are having to catch up around the country. And that's why we've now got schemes to help not just householders, but separate schemes to help farmers, rate relief for businesses and so on, because this is a very serious emergency in large parts of the country. And people need and deserve that help. And that's why the army have come in, and obviously the police are doing a good job, as they always do. And getting those...
But Max's point is different. It's that this has only happened because the flooding's in the southeast, isn't that right?
No, you're absolutely right. Here in Scunthorpe, we've got both the River Trent and the River Humber, which are extremely liable to flooding. Back in December, villages barely 5 miles down the road hundreds of people had to be evacuated. There are members of the audience here who had to raise thousands of pounds because they weren't getting any help. There was no news coverage. Nobody cared. There weren't any statements. There wasn't anybody going around in wellies looking daft. If it's not within 10 miles of London, they don't care. The severity...
Do you agree with that at the back?
I'd like to quote some figures to the panel, please, in relation to flooding historically in the UK. There's a blog currently on with Paul Hudson that presents North West weather. He has quoted that in 2007 there were 23,500 homes flooded in the UK, and last year in the Yorkshire and Humber region there were 66,000 homes flooded, and you can compare that to the Somerset levels, which apparently 40 houses were flooded.
Tonight we're in Scunthorpe, and welcome to Question Time. And welcome to you at home. Our audience here, of course, are going to ask the questions, and to our panel, who don't know those questions till they hear them. The Conservative Home Office Minister, Damien Green, Labour's Shadow Employment Minister, Chris Bryant. From UKIP, one of the party's leading candidates for this year's European elections, Janice Atkinson. The Daily Telegraph columnist, Christina Adone. And the Labour peer, broadcaster and Professor of Science and Society at Imperial College London, Robert Winston. Good. First question, Max Bell, please.
Why does it take flooding to hit the southeast of England before the Westminster Village notice or even care?
Damien Green.
I think that's half fair. I think a lot of it is...
Which bit?
Well, when you say the Westminster Village, it's certainly true that 24-hour news channels found it easier to get to the Thames Valley than they did to, say, the Somerset levels. But the truth is that the spread of the floods and the incessant nature of the bad weather has just made this a more important and bigger emergency as the weeks have passed. We now know that we've had the wettest period for 250 years. So it's not...
And saying, look, the dredging of the rivers, Parrett and Tone, must happen now because we can see, everybody's predicting a really bad winter. We can see what's going to happen. And the environmental agency said, no, it's not really necessary. So I think that Cameron himself, well, what could he do? But there's a regulatory body there. It's the environmental agency. Why were they so inactive? Why were they not responding to people who were calling and saying, we've lived here a long time, we know what is about to happen, let's not dilly-dally.
But we hear now that we hear now that dredging of the rivers would actually not benefit the people.
Well, not just the dredging.
It's just going to move the problem further down the stream.
But hang on a second. David Green, just comment on this, because you will remember that Mr. Pickles, Eric Pickles, the Community Secretary, said exactly what Christina Adone is saying. I apologise, I'm really sorry, we took the advice of what we thought we were dealing with experts. referring to the
Yeah,
environment.
and 10,000 staff.
Was that right? Is that the feeling in government, that you were let down by the environment?
Yeah, I mean, the feeling very strongly.
Or let down by Eric Pickles, one or the other.
No. It's that there is clearly a crisis which we need to sort out. And clearly...
Yeah, but just about the
not
Pickles.
everyone
Let's
does
just
things...
stick with the Pickles.
No, I mean...
He was very clear. He went on television and said, we thought we were dealing with experts. He criticised the Environment Agency for being responsible.
My understanding, and I don't intend to become this growing profession of armchair hydrologists, who the nation is now full of people, just as whenever we go to war, we all become armchair generals. We're now all becoming experts on river flows and hydrology. And I'm conscious that I'm not an expert. But my understanding is the council actually set up a compensation scheme straight away, which was very good and very sensible. And I think, I mean, I quite take the point. I remember at the time thinking, why is this not being reported? And the truth was, as I remember, it coincided with the death of Nelson Mandela, and the entire world media decamped to South Africa. So actually, I completely agree. It was certainly underreported.
Okay. You sit up there on the right. Yeah.
I think there's a serious lack of planning for flooding. There was, I think, David Cameron. The reason that he had no involvement for maybe 6 to 8 weeks was because he was letting the guys on the ground get into some kind of order as to what they were going to do with the floods. You know, for a start, people say, "What's David Cameron going to do? What is he going to do? Build a wall around the country?" You know, there were 60-foot waves crashing in on some of those beaches. We can't stop those kind of floods. Well, we're talking about groundwater now that's coming up from the water table. We can't prevent those kind of floods. That's going to come up. We've got that much rain coming down. And when I refer to the lack of planning, is it not now about time that the firefighters were used as a statutory obligation to respond to floods? Because at the moment they're responding out of the goodwill and using parts of the budget that are there for other activities.
Christina, you answer?
Well, I agree that there's not very much David Cameron can do except for wear wellies and go around for a photo op. But there is such a thing as the Environmental Agency. And what I'd like to point out to those of you who are very cross about the North and lack of activity, lack of support here. I have friends I have in-laws in Somerset and friends who are farmers in the Somerset levels. And they were calling the Environmental Agency in December before Christmas.
I understand that there are plenty of other properties that were cut off. And I understand that in comparison to the south of England currently, that pales into insignificance.
All right. But you think... Okay. Just
to be honest...
You've heard the number of people complaining about the way that they were treated.
To be honest, I'd be spitting with fury if I lived up here, because today it's announced that the people who were flooded in December are going to get the same money that was announced by David Cameron earlier this week, that is going to people in the Thames Valley and in Somerset. But why didn't that happen in December? In 2007, there was major flooding, as the lady just referred to at the back there. Major flooding in Hull. We had a scheme up in place in 2 weeks. It's 2 months that we've been talking about here, and longer in relation to the North East. And I remember when I was first elected in 2001, we had terrible flooding in the Rhondda, in 2 very small areas, and it was because basically the local authority there hadn't cleaned out the various water channels for a long time. There were bricks and all sorts of stuff in there, and that had built up. That meant that the water built up behind. And secondly, because the pumping station was frankly Victorian, and I get really depressed that we still talk about Isengard Kingdom Brunel's engineering and wanting to protect that. And what about modern engineering? Why are we still relying on Victorian engineering?
But let's go back to the point. You attacked the government, in effect, and everybody here was critical of government for doing nothing in December. The £5,000 people are now getting as a result of what happened in the Thames Valley. Why wasn't it offered here?
It was, as I remember, the local